Thank you for tuning in to Beyond the Brink and Fighting Back. I'm Rosemary Armeo, the host, and I'm talking today with Michelle Dworkin. She lives in Albany, New York, as do I, and she has spent more than 20 years working with USAID until earlier this year when Elon Musk and Donald Trump ended that agency. And I had long planned, this is the longtime listeners will know that I have followed this story. We've talked about it before. And I had planned an update, but I've rushed into production this week because of what happened in Jamaica last week. It's not the first natural disaster since Trump came into office, but it's the one closest to home, and it's a huge problem. And normally USAID would be incredibly busy this week. So, Michelle, I know this is not exactly what you did. I'm going to ask you in a minute to tell us a little bit about your experience with USAID, but can we begin with Jamaica? What should be happening right now that probably isn't because of the decision to end the life of USAID?
Thank you, Rosemary, so much for having me on the podcast and for continuing to spotlight what has happened to USAID and what the impacts are to the world and to the U.S. Following the dismantling of USAID by the current administration. In terms of what would have happened, we would have been prepared beforehand. We would have been tracking the hurricane season, and our Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, which had about 800 people, would have formed a disaster assistance response team, or a DART, along with a response management team, an RMT, back in Washington that would be running point on this disaster. We would have been pre-positioning supplies and food, and our USAID office in Jamaica would have been preparing as well. We did have an office in Jamaica that, of course, was shut down, just like all of our other offices. And we would have had local staff on the ground, as well as American staff, humanitarian assistance experts, landing right away to get food, safe water, shelter, hygiene supplies, etc., out to the most disaster-stricken areas as quickly as possible. And we would have been working with the Jamaican government to make that happen as well. I do understand that a DART was stood up with some former USAID staff, but I'm imagining that it's just not nearly at the same level of capacity funding-wise or personnel-wise or expertise-wise as it would have been previously. And more importantly, given just the immense scale of how many people were fired and how many resources were cut, it's not just about the immediate response. It's about what happens in the months afterwards, in the years afterwards, because recovery from such a devastating hurricane, as we've seen in our own country, when we've been hit with, such, strong winds and rains from hurricanes here, recovery takes years. And it's not just about meeting immediate needs, it's about rebuilding back stronger with the capacity and the systems to further withstand disasters, for when they happen again in the future.
A new documentary out about Katrina, which happened in our country and, of course, in New Orleans 20
Right.
years ago, talks about how USAID studied that disaster and learned from it. And the idea of putting together a team that could respond rapidly, that had material ready to move into place, took care of the immediate needs. and then plan for, and Jamaica's going to need this. The infrastructure is smashed. There's no power, widespread power outages. As a journalist, I was not impressed. What's the opposite? I was worried by how long it took for information, even about the extent of the damage. We still don't have an accurate death
Mhm.
estimate. So this is really it's remote and lacking in all communication. And we have what, Marco Rubio in charge now. I guess not even. He's even handed off USAID. Who's in charge of USAID anymore?
USAID functionally doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
There are perhaps a handful of staff just doing the final work to shut things down. Um, because even in the midst of such a disaster, the decision remains to get rid of USAID, that apparently this is not something that um, this administration thinks is important for our country. Um, or for the world. And so Marco Rubio is still the Secretary of State, and he has stated that the State Department will take on the few remnants of USAID. So I suppose he's managing it, but once again, only a few hundred of USAID's former staff went over to State Department to continue the 18% of our work that remains. It's a fraction, a small fraction of what we had been doing. And so much of the expertise, personnel, and resources has been lost. So it the US's work in terms of humanitarian assistance and international development is just pretty much gone at this
And
point.
I think Rubio has turned over the directorship, if that's the right word, of this remnant of USAID back to Russell Lloyd, who of course doesn't want any existence at all. But yet they still promise there would be a robust humanitarian response in Jamaica. And I
I
just
have no
can't figure out,
idea how that would even happen.
yeah,
How would that happen? I mean, it's a complete contradiction to literally cut the agency that did exactly that and
exactly.
then say there's going to be a robust response. I mean,
So
it just
who
it
fills
makes no sense.
it doesn't, I agree. But who fills in, Michelle? Is there another Jamaica can't do this on its own. Who fills in when the United States has now stepped back?
Unfortunately, a lot of other countries have stepped back as well. We've seen, European aid agencies have also, cut their budgets. And, even so, in the Western Hemisphere, the US was really the main bilateral donor agency
Right.
in these countries. We had been in Jamaica for a long time, and fortunately, because of some of our work with the government of Jamaica, and you know, they were perhaps a bit more prepared than they otherwise might have been had we not been there. Um, but still, the UN agencies are also struggling. Why is that? Because the US was a main contributor to UN
Correct.
agencies like the World Food Program, and other organizations that respond in a crisis like this. One of my former USAID colleagues, who was the last mission director in USAID, Jay Singh, he and some other colleagues have come together and formed an initiative called One Love, and they've been pulling together resources and supplies and getting down there. So that's a private, initiative that they've taken on because of their ongoing commitment to this work.
That was one of my questions for you. I know you've remained in touch with and working with former colleagues. It has to be so frustrating. Those of you who know how bad the situation is, how much the help is needed, and we're not giving it. The US government is not giving it. So, exactly that. Are there efforts to do it with other governments or with other grants from NGOs? Can you do anything? And you have to live yourself too. You have to make money in order to feed your own family. So, does any of that go on? You mentioned one lump.
There is, this one initiative that I know of with respect to Jamaica in particular. And early on, when the cut started coming down from on high, um, there there was a group of colleagues that came together to try to find other funding sources for some of the most critical work. So yes, that does happen. It does exist, but it's on a very small scale. And as you mentioned, it's devastating for the people that we used to serve. At the same time, we also have families we need to support.
Yeah.
Those of us, who were fired.
Absolutely. I remember asking when I did the first program, soon after the cut was made, um, if there was hope for USAID to come back. Trump goes away or is voted out, that would be nice. And we get another chance at it, but people have to go on and find other jobs. So is this lost forever? We're never going to have, or we won't for many years have an agency like this.
I mean, it. I do hope that it comes back someday. I will say this. The timing of our interview is also particularly poignant given that yesterday, November 3rd, was would have been the 64th anniversary of USAID's establishment by John F. Kennedy in 1961.
Right. I did actually notice that too. Yeah. I think he would be
Yeah,
pretty disappointed at this. He was astute in realizing that you become powerful by making friends. And this was an agency that helped and assisted and spread American influence. And I don't think a lot of citizens understand that. They just see it as a giveaway program, like sort of we look at down on it the way we do welfare programs too.
yeah, absolutely. And I think so to get back to your earlier question, I do hope USAID comes back in some form, and I think there is, a core group of people that would be motivated and dedicated to rebuilding. There are many of us who are very passionate about what we did, and would want to see that come back. I don't think it would come back in the same form. It's much harder to establish an agency than it is to destroy it. We saw,
Yeah.
how shockingly quick that destruction, unconstitutionally, by the way,
Yes.
and with no public objection from Republicans in Congress who had previously supported us, how quickly that happened. Um, but you're right that a lot of Americans, I think, were not aware of USAID until we started appearing in the news in January 2025. One of the main reasons for that is that we actually were not allowed to advocate for ourselves within the United States. Um, that was not, we were not supposed to use taxpayer money, appropriated funds to do that, which, was appropriate. We should not have been, promoting ourselves within the US. Our job was overseas. But you're absolutely right that the programs we undertook were not simply giveaways. First of all, um, the amount of money we spent was less than 1% of the federal budget. So
Another thing I don't think many citizens are aware of,
no,
this
and
idea that we're giving away money that should be spent here in the States.
right, and it's not an either or situation.
No.
It's a both and. There's enough to go
Right,
around,
right.
and they, programs and funds for Americans within the United States, are very much needed, and receive the vast majority of our funding. So it's not that we're taking money away from those programs. This is a very, very small portion of the budget. I mean, if you look at the amount that's being spent on, Trump's ballroom,
Yeah.
what USAID was spending, pales, in comparison, on an annual basis. And So what's really the better, what was the better deal for the American people? And it definitely was USAID. Whatever we were doing, it was, developed in close concert with other US government agencies to meet national security strategy priorities. And so the countries where we worked, the projects that we were doing, were developed to meet our own priorities as well as the priorities of the countries where we were working. And I think a point that often gets lost is that the way that we developed our programs and decided how to spend money, it was not really up to us in the executive branch. And that's just how our country works. And I think a lot of Americans forget that, is that we have a system of checks and balances.
Well, we used to. We
We
used to.
used to,
I'm not
exactly,
sure it's
exactly.
intact
I stand
now.
corrected. I stand corrected. But we have three branches of government, and the way that our Constitution was written gives Congress the power of the purse. So every year, for USAID and for other government spending as well, for other government agencies, the executive presents a budget proposal, which is just that, a proposal. But the executive does not or should not make the ultimate decisions about how much money each agency receives and for what end and purpose. Rather, Congress then takes that proposal and says, thank you very much. This is actually our job. And the appropriations committees in the House and the Senate hash out a bill every year. And in that bill, it goes into great detail. Again, not just about how much money, but for which accounts, for which purposes, even down to specific programs. So
Mhm.
every year when we received that appropriations bill and looked at it and said, okay, let's see, what did Congress, deem by law that we must spend?
Right.
We would then parse that out. And there were times when we didn't receive money that we really wanted and perhaps felt we needed to meet priorities in country or meet, urgent needs. And we couldn't because of the way that Congress appropriated the funds.
Now,
And
Michelle, I know that you
yeah,
have a bit of a grudge against Marco Rubio because he was
I do.
intimately involved in this process, as were you. You are describing your longtime job with USAID was matching congressional mandates with USAID action. And Marco
Yeah.
Rubio, as his committee assignments, his votes, all were supportive of USAID for years. Now he's talking about it as an agency that was off the rails, I think he said, and needed to be reined in. And that irked you.
Oh, it still irks me. Yes. I think, he's shown his true colors. Um, I know who I am. I know who my colleagues are from USAID, and I know that we abided by appropriations law. I know that in addition, we reported before we spent a single cent of taxpayer money, we were required by that appropriations law to send forward to Congress documents known as congressional notifications.
Right.
And these detailed, each one for each country was usually about, depending on the size of the budget, but you know, the ones that I worked on, could be up to 15 pages of detailed budget tables and narrative by country, by account, and by sector, detailing how we planned to spend that money for a particular fiscal year and which partner organizations would be receiving those funds. Those congressional notifications had to sit with our committees of jurisdiction, which included the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, on which Marco
Marco
Rubio
Rubio's.
served as a senior member
Right.
for many years. Those congressional notifications had to sit for 15 days. And that gave plenty of time for those committees to ask us questions, to present concerns that we had to then address. Um,
So, Michelle, then in January, when you're reading all of a sudden about fraud, waste, and abuse, I believe those were the terms,
Correct.
and that's why USAID had to be dismantled. Did you take that personally? That's your direct work that they were criticizing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I took that very personally. I think we all did because we worked with integrity and we were held to very high standards. We all um, took training every year and were held to very high ethical standards. And if we violated those, there were consequences. We held security clearances. Many of my colleagues held warrants to, um, manage contracts and grants. And we took that responsibility of being public servants and managing the taxpayers' money very, very seriously. And we reported on those funds, not just how we would use them, but on the
You
results we
did.
achieved.
Right, right.
And all of those documents, by the way, were publicly available on our website. It's
So,
just that many Americans didn't know about us until January 2025
and what they're
to,
hearing is all negative then. Yeah.
right. And so before then, they could have gone on. They could have read all of our program evaluations going back decades. They could have looked at our budget. They could have looked at all of this information. But by the time people realized what was happening to USAID and the Doge narrative took over of waste, fraud, and abuse, what did Doge do? They took down our website.
Right, right. Oh
So
my
then
goodness.
nobody could
Wow.
look at
Wow.
the information that we were transparently presenting for decades.
I think that USAID has been misunderstood internationally, not just in our own country.
Mhm.
I never worked directly for them, but I worked for a media development agencies that got tons of funding. A very important aspect of
Mhm.
USAID to develop democracy by strengthening the free press. I worked on many of those programs in Eastern Europe and other places, and wherever I worked, because they knew about federal government funding from the U.S. We were
Mhm.
seeing the CIA. We had to be, American agents.
Yeah.
That was not understood by the governments there as well as our own people here. That's highly frustrating. Tell us, Michelle Dworkin, a little bit about how you got involved with USAID. You were pretty young when
Sure.
you started working with the agency.
Yeah, so I joined the agency back in 2008. Before I joined USAID, I worked for about 5 years on USAID-funded programming
Mhm.
with one of what was known as our implementing partners. So an organization that actually, implemented the contract, contracts with USAID, with USAID money. And then I joined USAID directly in 2008. I joined actually during the George W. Bush administration, when that administration realized that our country needed more foreign service officers. They needed to hire beyond just the need to cover attrition rates, that we really
Right.
needed a more robust USAID foreign service. And so that's when I joined, actually. Um, and my first post was Cairo, Egypt. I then went on to serve for a year on a military base in Western Afghanistan, just outside the city of Herat. And I then served in Guatemala for 4 years. Then I went back to Washington, where I worked on congressional affairs. And then I served in Honduras for 4 years, and then I served in Colombia. I was supposed to have been in Colombia for 4 years. My tour was cut short because of the dismantling of USAID, so I only ended up being in Colombia for 2 years.
And so here you are in Albany, New York, and
Hmm.
you're um, you've lost your career. what has the American people, what have they lost because we've lost your expertise? And I'm using you as an example for all the other ones. What are we giving up?
I think we're giving up national security. I think we're giving up our reputation. I think we're ceding space to other global powers. I think we are losing trade partners, and we are, creating a world that is much more vulnerable to instability.
Wow. Okay, so let me ask you a hard question here. I'm an ardent anti-Trumper, and I find myself having to discipline my thinking that when something bad happens in a red state or to a Trump supporter or to a Latino voter who was pro-Trump and now is losing a family member to deportation, I have to fight against myself to feel happy about that. Like,
Mhm.
you asked for this, you get it. Do you have the same thing? Are you looking for, I don't know, and it could be anything these days, starvation in Sudan or flooding in the Philippines, both of which are happening right now, unresponded to by us. Do you have to fight back the feeling like, oh, wow, we could have done something about this? This will show them.
Um, I mean, I see where you're coming from, but I can't blame the people who are suffering
Oh,
overseas.
no.
Um, I definitely have that feeling of, wow, USAID could have prevented this, or could
Could
have
have eased it.
mitigated that disaster, or we could have, you know, addressed, all of the deaths that are now happening. Um, and it's absolutely devastating to just have to stand by and be crippled and not able to step in and help anymore.
I've been watching the news every day for looking for the effects of it. A preventable disease, HIV is not being
Yeah.
treated as much in Africa anymore. Even tuberculosis.
No. And children are literally dying, and
Is
it does
anybody
not
keeping
need to
track of
happen.
that? Certainly, the Trump administration won't. Does anybody keep track of who is dying because America stopped being interested in them?
Yeah, well, the Lancet came out with a report that included, I forget how many million exactly deaths they estimated will result from the dismantling of USAID. And in addition, Nicholas Kristof with the New York Times has done some very personal individual reporting, particularly from the Democratic Republic of the Congo,
Congo, yeah, the Congo's really
naming
been.
very specific people who have died and tracing that with a direct line to USAID's destruction.
Well, I also want to ask you about the current government shutdown,
Yeah.
which of course is not directly connected to ending USAID. But what I find interesting is that there is a incredible disrespect for federal workers
Absolutely.
on the part. I mean, you're the deep state. You were someone trying to, I don't know, project liberal values and wokeness onto the
Mhm.
onto the American people that they didn't want. Um, do you have a response to that? Do you have an argument against it that you could make?
Yes.
Please do.
Many, again, it goes back to, where does our budget come from? Our budget comes from Congress. So we were following the law. We were following appropriations law as set out by Democrats and Republicans in Congress. They have to come to an agreement. And there are years when Republicans were in the majority, there are years when Democrats were in the majority. And we followed whatever appropriations law came to us. And so we spent the budget as dictated by the legislative branch, which is how it is supposed to work per our Constitution. In addition, many of us, myself included, we worked for the federal government for many, many years across many administrations. As I mentioned, I joined during the George W. Bush administration. I worked under Obama. I worked under Trump 1, and then I worked under Biden. So it didn't matter who was in power. Did our jobs again with integrity. And none of us did this to get rich. I
Hmm.
mean, a federal government job isn't, it's not known for being a moneymaker here. Who are the moneymakers? Us or Elon Musk over at X, with all of his various companies and all of the tech bros working for him? Who was looking to get rich here?
Right. Right.
Who
He's up
was,
for
and
a trillion
who
dollar
was
a year.
right,
Sorry. Yeah,
and
Elon
who
is up
was,
for $1 trillion a year
yeah,
salary right now, with all
yeah.
that.
The federal government, no, it doesn't work like the private sector. Could it be improved? Sure, there are processes that can be improved. Could USAID have been improved? Absolutely. And we were working on that. I saw the evolution of USAID over the years that I was there. Um, but you don't overhaul something by just completely dismantling it without setting out something else up in its place and also without understanding it. The federal government doesn't work like the private sector, and it's not supposed to because it doesn't serve a private sector function.
Right.
It exists to serve the American people, whether that's profitable or not. And I think, people are feeling that now with the loss of SNAP benefits, with, loss of, access to health care. The government is there to help people to serve, not to turn a profit.
Right.
And, it's not just a bunch of woke bureaucrats in Washington. Federal government workers are around the country.
I'm not sure where the idea came from that Trump would be a great president because he was a successful, I'm using air quotes here, businessman. Business is not the same as business
No, it's
for
not. And
profit, not
yeah,
yeah, not for the well-being of people. One thing I have not understood, 18% of the programming, a tiny percentage, yes, but 18% was reserved and moved over to the State Department. What
yes.
what did those programs involve? What has been preserved? Not helping famine, war, genocide in Sudan, not preventable deaths or health clinics in Africa. What got preserved?
Some humanitarian assistance and some health programming. That's it.
Wow. So
And I
that's where
will
the money
say,
would go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say that. So that's where some money or assistance to Jamaica might come from.
Exactly. Um, but I was part of the so-called foreign assistance review process. When the executive order came down that, all foreign assistance had to be paused for a review, first of all, it took forever for us to actually get any guidance that made any sense, any sort of sense
Yeah. What were
about
you
what that
reviewing?
actually meant.
Yeah.
Um, and, we assumed, okay, that means no new programming, but surely our ongoing programming, we're not just going to stop it. I mean, that would just be horribly disruptive to people's lives. Um, and, not to mention, we would be, violating the terms of contracts with our partners. Um, and in the end, it actually did mean, yes, stop everything, which was just absolutely not
Wow.
practical. And what that looked like in practice was that the Doge tech bros literally shut off our access to our financial systems.
Oof.
And so we were unable to pay partners for work performed prior to January 20th, 2025. That is illegal. And so they were the ones saying, oh, look, there's all this corruption in the financial system. But they shut off our financial officers' access so they could not pay for work performed under government contract. Tell me, in what country, in what society is that okay to not pay for work performed? And guess what happened? We racked up thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in late fees. So once
Oh,
we were finally able to pay that money back, guess what everyone's taxpayer dollars went for?
late
To
fees.
pay late
Oh my
fees.
gosh. Oh my
And
gosh.
is that not waste, fraud, and abuse?
Yes, it is.
And, of course, not to mention that, all the inspectors general that were fired, whose literal job it was to find waste, fraud, and abuse. Why would you fire the very person whose job that was if you were so intent on finding waste, fraud, and abuse? Um, and so to get back to the foreign assistance review, once we actually got guidance from Washington on what they wanted, we worked very hard to look at all of the programs that we had. I was in Colombia at the time, and so we looked at all of the programs we had in Colombia. We were asked to fill out spreadsheet upon spreadsheet with very detailed information about how each activity did or did not meet specific national security priorities, the amount of funding that was supporting, various initiatives. And we filled this information out, and supposedly all of our activities were to receive a score that would then determine which activities would continue to move forward or not. We made proposals for which activities we felt were of the highest priority. Um, and wouldn't you know, pretty much like the day after we finished this and submitted it, that's when the ex post came out. We're cutting 83%. I mean, it was all for show. They
Yeah.
did not look at this.
Okay.
Someone did calculations of how that if Marco Rubio actually reviewed, like he said he did, all of the programming, he would have had, something like 10 seconds per program. I mean, tell me that it was not a
Not
serious
impossible. Yeah, it's
review.
impossible.
The intent from the very beginning was to shut us down and cut nearly everything.
To
So there
make a
was
show
no
as if it
serious,
is.
yeah, there
Yeah.
was no serious review whatsoever. I worked on that review. I worked hard on it with my colleague, and nobody looked at it because we were getting directions even as the review was going on. Before the review came out, we were receiving directions to cut programs. And I mean, the the way it was coming out was terminate this program, terminate that program. You could tell they were using AI
Wow.
because we got, for example, one of our programs that we thought would appeal to the Trump administration was something that was called the Migrant Economic Inclusion Program,
Uh-huh.
which worked with Venezuelan migrants in Colombia to help them um, gain training and uh, get jobs or start their own businesses to build a livelihood in Colombia rather than making the very difficult decision to make a dangerous journey north. That was one of the first programs that we got instructions to terminate, and we were wondering why. And then we realized, oh, of course, it's got the word inclusion in it. So
Oh my
the
gosh.
Doge AI is
It's
trying
just
to find
hitting on the word.
anything with like diversity, equity, inclusion, without even thinking. They just think that AI can do everything
This is
and that they don't
horrible.
need actual people to do the thinking. I heard of other, USAID missions around the world where biodiversity programs were
Because of
canceled because
diversity.
diversity, yes.
Yeah. Locally, one of the people working on justice programs talked about how they
Mhm.
have been going through grants doing exactly that, changing words. So at one point,
Mhm.
they had a grant that was for Chinese immigrants, and they figured that would set off AI. So they changed it to rice eaters, and that worked. The grant went through. That's crazy stuff. Do you really want to go back to work ever for the federal government after all this?
I would go back to work for the federal government under an administration that truly believes in the value of public service and the value of serving the American people without personal interest and personal gain.
And do you think that's the Trump administration at any point?
Oh, no.
Definitely
No, I
not.
mean, it's been painfully obvious. I mean, every decision he makes is for his own profit.
It seems that way. Um, you have extensive experience in Latin America, so I want to sort of, we're getting towards the end here, but I want to ask you, um, if we have no programs now to help these countries to actually go in and be supportive of health or education or family contraception or anything like that, and yet we are protecting them maybe by blowing their boats out of the water that are dealing drugs. What do you think of that? Extra legal at sea death.
Um,
Good
I,
replacement for USAID?
yeah, no. So I think, we had, many years ago, shortly after I joined USAID, we started speaking about the 3D model, defense, diplomacy, and development.
Mhm.
And that was well understood, not just within USAID, not just within the State Department, but by our Defense Department colleagues as well. I've collaborated with the military in a number of the posts at which I served, and they well understood the value of USAID because if we were there, it meant, first of all, we were a heck of a lot cheaper than
Sure.
any Defense Department operation. But they understood that if USAID was there, that we were there sustaining positive change so that we would not need to send in troops in the future. Um, and just as an example, in terms of, the attacks on, boats related to, narco trafficking, um, guess who was doing a lot of work successfully on counter narcotics in Colombia and other countries in the region? That's right, USAID. Um, our Defense Department and law enforcement colleagues could collaborate with Colombian military and Colombian law enforcement to eradicate coca and to, fight back against armed groups that were, trafficking in cocaine, for their own profit. But once an area was secured, um, they were not positioned to go in and help former coca growers, link up with
Right,
illicit markets. That
right.
was not their expertise, nor should it have been. That was our expertise in USAID. And we did that for a fraction of the cost of one of those planes blowing boats out of the water. Um, we worked with the Colombian government to develop land tenure systems to give former coca growers who committed to not regrowing coca, giving them land titles, which is hugely valuable.
Right.
And as long as they kept their plots coca free, they retained that land title. Um, we went in with the technical assistance to provide crops and techniques for growing licit crops, legal
Mhm.
crops that
Legal
could
stuff.
be profitable. We linked them with the private sector, with markets, so that they had a place to sell those crops and so that they could make a living um, in a different way, and support their families and move forward and, move beyond the threat of, armed groups and, what they represented. Um, and we're not there anymore.
I'm glad you can speak out now. This it might have made a difference if we had heard some of these stories before, Michelle. What comes next for you now?
Well, I grew up in the area and near Albany, and my parents still live here, and so I moved back with my child, and I'm looking for a job. I hope to continue um, being of service. So I do hope to find a job either with New York State government or local government here or in the nonprofit sector, continuing to serve.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us, and I hope we can call on you in the future. I intend to keep following this. What happens when we end Robert Kennedy, not Robert, oh my goodness, wrong Kennedy, John Kennedy. So, geez, slip of the tongue.
Yeah.
What happens when we get rid of a really inspired program? Thank you so much for your service and for being here today.
Thank you so much.